In the bustling heart of Seattle, Jennifer Adams, a seemingly invisible strategist, was about to take control of her own professional destiny. What began as a simple day at the office took a dramatic turn when she discovered a carefully orchestrated betrayal within her own team. Jennifer Adams wasn't your typical senior marketing strategist. For 8 years, she had been the driving force behind multi-million-dollar campaigns, known for her strategic acumen and impeccable client relationships. When she noticed Lisa Rodriguez, a junior strategist, claiming her ideas as her own, Jennifer had no idea she was stepping into a battle that would force her to decide whether to quietly accept the status quo or reclaim the value of her own work. Jennifer chose the latter, using patience and strategic collaboration to build a quiet revolution that would forever change the agency's trajectory. What began as a subtle act of office diplomacy would soon lead to Jennifer's transformation from a sidelined employee to an independent strategic consultant. The agency that once overlooked her would never be the same after she realized her true worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They say success speaks for itself, but sometimes the loudest voice in the room drowns out everything else, including the truth. I learned this lesson the hard way after 8 years of building campaigns that turned struggling brands into household names and clients who couldn't pronounce my name into million-dollar accounts that kept our Seattle agency's lights on. My name is Jennifer Adams, and I've been a senior marketing strategist at Meridian Creative for 8 years now. 8 years of 60-hour weeks, weekend client calls, and presentations that I'd rehearse in my bathroom mirror until every transition was seamless. I wasn't just good at my job, I was exceptional at it. My client retention rate was 94%. My campaigns generated an average ROI of 320%, and I'd never missed a deadline, not once. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. The morning it all started to unravel was a Tuesday in March. I walked into our glass-walled conference room carrying the StormTech campaign proposal I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting. The research alone had taken me 40 hours of deep dives into consumer behavior analytics, competitive landscape mapping, and brand positioning strategies. I knew every demographic breakdown, every market penetration opportunity, every potential objection and its corresponding solution. Darren Patel, our CEO, sat at the head of the table scrolling through his phone with that distracted expression he wore when he thought he had more important things to think about. Alice Reed from Creative was reviewing her own notes, and Michael Tran, my mentor and the only person in that room who truly understood the intricacies of long-term client relationships, gave me an encouraging nod. Then Lisa Rodriguez walked in. Lisa had joined our team 18 months ago as a junior strategist, all charm and ambition wrapped in designer blazers that probably cost more than my rent. She possessed that particular brand of confidence that made people lean in when she spoke, even when she wasn't saying anything particularly insightful. I'd watched her climb the agency ladder with impressive speed, though I'd never quite understood how she managed to be in the right place at the right time for every major win. That morning, she slid into the seat directly across from Darren and smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she knew something the rest of us didn't. "Before Jennifer presents," she said, her voice carrying that practiced cadence of someone who'd spent time in front of mirrors too, "I wanted to share some thoughts I've been developing on the StormTech approach." My stomach dropped. The StormTech approach was my approach. I'd been working on it for weeks, had shared early concepts with the team, had even bounced ideas off Lisa during our supposedly collaborative brainstorming session. But Lisa launched into a presentation that was unmistakably mine, down to the specific language I'd used to describe their target demographic as digitally native outdoor enthusiasts seeking authentic adventure experiences. She presented my consumer journey mapping, my competitive positioning strategy, even my recommendation for influencer partnerships that I'd researched and vetted personally. The room was captivated. Darren actually put his phone down, which was basically the equivalent of a standing ovation. Alice scribbled notes furiously, and I sat there watching my work being praised while my name was nowhere to be found in the conversation. "This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking that sets us apart," Darren said, his eyes fixed on Lisa with an approval I'd been chasing for years. "Lisa, this is remarkable work. How did you come up with the adventure experience angle?" Lisa launched into an explanation of her research process, describing insights that had come from late nights I'd spent analyzing consumer data, from conversations I'd had with Stormtech's marketing director, from the competitive analysis I'd conducted while she was posting Instagram stories from her weekend wine tasting. I opened my mouth to speak, to gently correct the record, to at least acknowledge that this had been a collaborative effort. But something in Lisa's expression stopped me. There was a challenge there, a dare almost, as if she was waiting to see what I would do. The rest of the room was so enamored with her brilliance that any correction from me would look like jealousy, like an attempt to steal credit from their new golden child. So I said nothing. I smiled and nodded, and even offered a few supportive comments about how Lisa's approach aligned perfectly with the brand's value. I watched as she basked in praise that should have been mine, as Darren talked about fast-tracking her to senior strategist, as Alice suggested she take the lead on the client presentation. After the meeting, I walked back to my desk in a day. The open office buzzed with its usual energy, but I felt like I was moving through water. Emily Fields, one of our junior associates, stopped by my desk with a confused expression. "Hey, wasn't that Stormtech concept something you'd been working on?" she asked, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. I looked up at her, this earnest young woman who still believed that hard work and honesty were enough to succeed in our industry. "We all contribute to the best ideas," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "It's collaborative." Emily nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She'd been watching, paying attention, learning not just about marketing but about the complex dynamics that really drove success in our world. That night, I stayed late in the office, not because I had work to do but because I needed the silence to think. The building was nearly empty, just the hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. I pulled up the Stormtech files on my computer, scrolled through weeks of research and strategy development, all of it time-stamped and documented. I had proof, I had evidence, I had every email, every iteration, every late-night breakthrough that had led to the campaign Lisa had presented as her own. But I also had something else, the growing realization that this wasn't really about one campaign or one moment of credit theft. This was about something deeper, something that had been building for months without me fully recognizing it. I was being erased, slowly and strategically, by someone who understood the game better than I'd given her credit for. The question was, what was I going to do about it? The weeks following the Stormtech presentation felt like watching a slow-motion car crash, where I was both the observer and the victim. Lisa's star continued to rise while I found myself increasingly pushed to the margins of conversations I'd once led. It started with small things. Client emails that had previously been addressed to me began including Lisa as a primary contact. Meeting invitations that once had my name at the top now listed her as the strategic lead. Project folders that I'd created and organized were suddenly being managed by someone else. The most painful part wasn't the professional slight, it was the way everyone seemed to accept this shift as natural, even inevitable. Like Lisa had always been the driving force behind our team's success, and I'd just been along for the ride. 3 weeks after the Stormtech meeting, I arrived at the office to find my keycard access to the executive conference room had been revoked. I discovered this when I tried to enter the weekly strategy sync and found myself locked out, watching through the glass walls as Lisa presented what appeared to be our Q2 roadmap to the senior leadership team. "Oh, Jennifer." Kate Thompson from HR appeared at my elbow, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced cheerfulness that people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "We've restructured the meeting format. Lisa's handling the strategic overviews now, and you'll be focusing more on execution and client maintenance." Client maintenance. The phrase hit me like a slap, but too numerous to combat individually. "They're using reputation management firms," Daniel Carter explained when she called for advice. "Corporate crisis consultants who specialize in destroying accusers. I've seen it before. They create an alternative narrative that makes you the villain." The professional isolation was worse than the public attacks. Former Meridian colleagues stopped returning her calls. Industry contacts who'd previously offered networking opportunities suddenly became unavailable. Conference organizers who'd invited her to speak rescinded invitations due to controversy. Amanda Foster, Meridian's head of legal, called unexpectedly. "Emma, I hope you understand this isn't personal. Meridian is defending its interests by destroying my reputation, by protecting intellectual property that belongs to the company. Your innovations were developed using Meridian resources during Meridian employment within the scope of your Meridian responsibilities. I filed provisional patents before presenting to the board. Individual patent filings don't override employment agreements. Your contract assigned all innovations to Meridian, regardless of when you filed personal applications." Emma had studied her employment contract countless times, but Amanda's confidence was unsettling. "Are you saying my patents are invalid?" "I'm saying corporate employment law is more complex than individual engineers typically understand." After the call, Emma retreated to her apartment, feeling the weight of forces arrayed against her. Meridian's legal team, public relations consultants, and corporate resources created an ecosystem designed to crush individual challenges. She was David facing Goliath, but Goliath had lawyers, money, and media manipulation capabilities she'd never anticipated. Her parents called that evening, their voices strained with worry. "Misha, we've been getting phone calls, people asking questions about your childhood, your academic record, your personal relationships. Someone called my principal's office," her father added. "Wanted to know about your family background, whether we'd had legal troubles, financial problems." The realization hit like ice water. Meridian wasn't just attacking her professional credibility. They were investigating her family, looking for ammunition to use against her character. The privacy she'd taken for granted was being systematically violated. Michael's law firm began facing pressure as well. Corporate clients hinted that association with Emma's case might affect future business relationships. The managing partners scheduled meetings to discuss the reputational risks of taking on Meridian Industries. "They're trying to isolate you completely," Michael explained. "Professional isolation, social media destruction, family harassment. It's designed to make continuation impossible." Emma felt herself changing under the assault. The idealistic engineer who'd believed in corporate fairness was being replaced by someone harder, more calculating. She began documenting every attack, every suspicious coincidence, every coordinated effort to destroy her credibility. Her phone rang. Jessica Williams, calling from a blocked number. "Emma, you need to drop this lawsuit. Blackstone is furious. He's hired private investigators to dig into your personal life. They're looking for anything: financial problems, relationship issues, academic irregularities. Let them look." "You don't understand. They're professionals at finding ammunition. Everyone has something they don't want public." Emma realized Jessica was warning her despite the professional risks. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're my friend. Because what they're doing is wrong. But I still can't testify. I can't lose everything for a case you might not win." That night, Emma sat in her apartment reviewing the legal battlefield. Meridian's counterattack was comprehensive: legal motions to dismiss, character assassination through paid consultants, professional isolation, family harassment, and private investigation into her personal life. She was fighting a war she'd never trained for, using weapons she'd never held against enemies with unlimited resources. The pure engineering problem she'd thought she was solving had become a complex challenge involving law, media manipulation, corporate power, and personal survival. But something had crystallized in the face of their attacks. Every assault on her character, every attempt to silence her, every coordinated effort to destroy her credibility, proved the importance of what she was fighting for. If Meridian would go to these lengths to avoid accountability, how many other engineers had they silenced through intimidation? Emma opened her laptop and began documenting the harassment campaign. If they wanted to make this about character, she would show the tech industry exactly what corporate character looked like when challenged. The idealistic engineer was gone, replaced by someone who understood that justice required not just documentation and legal representation, but the willingness to absorb punishment, that would destroy most people. She'd wanted to protect her innovation. Now she was fighting for the principle that individual engineers deserved protection from corporate predation. The cost was higher than she'd imagined, but the alternative, proving that power could silence innovation through systematic destruction, was unacceptable. Amanda Foster called again the next morning. "Emma, I've been reviewing your case files. There are things about Meridian's response that concern me professionally. Meaning I think we should meet, privately." The call ended, leaving Emma staring at her phone. Amanda Foster was Meridian's head of legal, the person coordinating their defense strategy. Why would she want a private meeting with the plaintiff, unless Meridian's attacks had crossed lines that even their own legal counsel found unacceptable? Emma spent 3 sleepless nights considering Amanda Foster's cryptic phone call before agreeing to meet. They chose a small cafe in Fremont, far from downtown's tech corridor, where either might be recognized. Amanda arrived early, choosing a corner table with clear sightlines, the precautions of someone who understood surveillance. She looked exhausted, her usually immaculate professional appearance slightly disheveled. "Emma, what I'm about to tell you could end my career. Are you recording this conversation?" "No, because what Meridian is doing, some of it crosses ethical boundaries that I can't professionally ignore." Amanda opened her briefcase, revealing printed emails and internal documents. "Blackstone ordered the harassment campaign against your family. He personally approved hiring private investigators to dig into your personal life. He's pressuring our corporate clients to avoid Michael's law firm." Emma studied the documents, recognizing email addresses and corporate signatures. "Why are you showing me?" "Because I became a lawyer to practice law, not to enable corporate bullying." Amanda's voice carried the strain of someone who'd struggled with conscience and chosen principle. "I have daughters. Someday they might face similar challenges. But what I was actually doing was creating a detailed record of my contributions, while building a network of allies who could see the real dynamics at play." The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging client crisis with Evergreen Hospitality, a boutique hotel chain that had been with us for 2 years. Their new marketing director, Sarah Chen, had called an emergency meeting after their latest campaign had failed to generate the expected booking increases. Lisa was supposed to lead the crisis response, but within the first 10 minutes of the call, it became clear that she didn't understand the nuances of the hospitality industry's seasonal booking patterns. She kept referring to standard consumer behavior models, while Sarah grew increasingly frustrated with answers that didn't address the specific challenges of their business. I watched this unfold from my position as the support strategist on the call, taking notes and observing the growing tension between Lisa's confident assertions and Sarah's pointed questions about implementation details. Finally, Sarah asked a direct question about how our proposed solution would address the specific problem of midweek occupancy rates during their shoulder season. Lisa's response was generic, filled with marketing buzzwords, but lacking any real understanding of the operational realities of hotel management. "I think Jennifer might have some insights on this," Lisa said, turning to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "She's been so helpful with the research side of things." This was my moment. I could either continue to play the supporting role, or I could demonstrate exactly what Lisa was missing. "Thank you, Lisa," I said, my voice calm and measured. "Sarah, I've been analyzing your occupancy data for the past 18 months, and I think the issue is more complex than a simple awareness problem." For the next 15 minutes, I walked Sarah through a detailed analysis of her property's booking patterns, comparing them to industry benchmarks, and identifying specific opportunities for midweek package development. I referenced conversations we'd had about their business model, seasonal challenges, and operational constraints, things that Lisa had never bothered to learn. Sarah's relief was palpable. "This is exactly what I needed to hear," she said. "Jennifer, can you put together a revised strategy proposal based on this analysis?" I glanced at Lisa, who was trying to maintain her composure while clearly struggling with the fact that her client was now bypassing her to work directly with me. "Of course, I'll have a preliminary framework to you by tomorrow, and Lisa and I can collaborate on the full presentation." After the call ended, Lisa and I sat in my office, discussing next steps. I maintained my supportive demeanor, but I could see the calculation in her eye. She was beginning to understand that taking credit for my work was one thing, but actually replacing my capabilities was something entirely different. "That was great work on the call," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "I'm glad we have your expertise on the team." "We're all here to serve our clients," I replied. "That's what makes us successful." But Lisa's comment about my expertise stayed with me. It was a subtle acknowledgement that she needed me, even as she continued to position herself as the strategic leader of our team. That evening, I made a decision that would prove to be pivotal. Instead of simply reacting to Lisa's moves, I would begin making moves of my own. I started by scheduling individual coffee meetings with key people throughout the agency, not to complain about Lisa or to lobby for recognition, but to strengthen relationships and ensure that people understood my role in our team's success. I met with Alice Reed from Creative to discuss how strategic insights could better inform visual storytelling. I spent time with our analytics team, helping them understand how to frame data in ways that would be most useful for client presentations. I even scheduled time with Kate from HR to discuss professional development opportunities and my long-term career goal. Each conversation was carefully crafted to demonstrate my value while building alliances that would serve me well regardless of how the Lisa situation evolved. The most important of these conversations was with Michael Tran, who had been watching the dynamics on our team with growing concern. "You're handling this situation with remarkable grace," he said during one of our regular mentoring sessions. "But I have to ask, what's your end game here?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for weeks. What was my end game? Was I trying to outlast Lisa? Was I hoping that her lack of substance would eventually catch up with her? Was I building towards some kind of dramatic confrontation? "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "But I'm learning that sometimes the best strategy is to let people reveal themselves while you focus on building something better." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "That's wise, but make sure you're not just reacting to her moves. At some point you need to be proactive about your own future." His words stayed with me as I continued to navigate the increasingly complex dynamics of our team. Lisa's influence was still growing. She'd been officially promoted to senior strategist and was now leading our quarterly planning sessions. But I was beginning to see signs that her rapid ascent was creating its own problem. Younger team members were coming to me with questions about strategic frameworks and client management, areas where Lisa's knowledge was shallow. Clients were increasingly requesting my direct involvement in campaigns, sometimes bypassing Lisa entirely. Even Darren had started asking me to attend meetings that Lisa was supposedly leading, though he framed it as collaborative leadership. The most telling moment came during a team meeting when Lisa was presenting our Q3 strategy. She'd built her presentation around a framework that I'd developed months earlier, but she'd simplified it to the point where it was no longer strategically sound. When Alice asked a probing question about implementation challenges, Lisa's answer revealed that she didn't understand the underlying logic of the framework she was presenting. I watched this unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Lisa was beginning to expose her own limitations, but she was doing it while representing strategies that I'd developed. If her presentations failed, it would reflect poorly on all of us. After the meeting, I made another strategic decision. Instead of letting Lisa continue to oversimplify my work, I would begin developing new frameworks and approaches that I could control more directly. I started working on what I called next-generation strategic models, advanced approaches to client development, and campaign optimization that went beyond anything Lisa had ever claimed credit for. I documented everything meticulously, trademarked the language, and began implementing these approaches with select clients who appreciated sophisticated strategic thinking. The most significant of these was Pacific Northwest Tech, where Tom Woo-Myan had been expressing increasing frustration with the gap between Lisa's promises and the actual strategic depth of our work. "Jennifer," he said during one of our regular check-ins, "I have to be honest with you. The work has been good, but it's not at the level we've come to expect from your team. Is everything okay?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. Tom was giving me an opening to demonstrate my value in a way that Lisa couldn't replicate or claim credit for. "I appreciate your candor, Tom," I said. I've been developing some new strategic approaches that I think could take your campaigns to the next level. Would you be interested in exploring some advanced frameworks that go beyond our standard offerings? Tom's interest was immediate. Absolutely. What did you have in mind? For the next hour, I walked him through strategic concepts that I'd been developing specifically for clients who wanted cutting-edge thinking. These weren't frameworks that Lisa had ever seen or could claim credit for. They were entirely my creation, documented and refined through months of careful development. By the end of our conversation, Tom was excited about the possibilities and eager to move forward with what he called the most sophisticated strategic thinking we've encountered in years. As I walked back to the office, I realized that my endgame was finally becoming clear. I wasn't just trying to outlast Lisa or expose her limitations. I was building a parallel reputation, one that existed independently of our agency's internal politics and Lisa's credit-claiming strategies. The question was, what would I do with this parallel reputation once it was fully established? The call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing campaign performance metrics for our Q3 client report. Tom Nguyen's name appeared on my phone screen, and I answered expecting another routine check-in about Pacific Northwest Tech's upcoming product launch. Instead, Tom's voice carried an excitement that immediately caught my attention. "Jennifer, I hope you have a few minutes to talk. I have a proposition that I think might interest you." I glanced around the open office, noting that Lisa was in Darren's office for what appeared to be another strategic planning session, and Emily was at her desk, absorbed in a presentation deck. "Of course, Tom. What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about the advanced strategic frameworks you've been developing. The work you've done for us over the past few months has been exceptional, and it's got me wondering about something. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. I felt my pulse quicken. There was something in Tom's tone that suggested this wasn't a typical client conversation. "I'm listening. How would you feel about taking on a consulting role? Independent from Meridian, working directly with companies that need the kind of sophisticated strategic thinking you've been developing. I've been talking to some colleagues in the industry, and there's definitely demand for someone with your expertise and track record." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to fully consider. An independent consulting role would mean leaving Meridian, leaving behind 8 years of building relationships and establishing myself within the agency's structure. But it would also mean freedom from the politics, from watching Lisa take credit for my work, from the slow erosion of my professional identity. That's a significant proposition, Tom. I know it is, and I want to be clear that this isn't coming from any dissatisfaction with Meridian as a whole. This is about recognizing exceptional talent and making sure it has the right platform to flourish. Tom went on to explain that he'd been discussing the idea with marketing directors at 3 other companies, all of whom had worked with me indirectly through Meridian's campaign. They were interested in accessing my strategic expertise without the overhead and bureaucracy of a full agency relationship. "We're talking about retained consulting arrangements," Tom continued. "Steady monthly fees for strategic guidance, plus project-based work for major campaigns. It could be quite lucrative, and it would give you the freedom to work with clients who truly value sophisticated strategic thinking." I found myself walking to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline while processing the magnitude of what Tom was proposing. Below, the city buzzed with activity, thousands of people pursuing their careers, building their futures, making choices about how to spend their professional lives. "Can I ask what prompted this conversation?" I said. Tom was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I've been increasingly frustrated with the disconnect between the quality of work we're getting and the strategic depth I know you're capable of. When you showed me those advanced frameworks last week, it reminded me of why I've always enjoyed working with you. You see things other people miss. You understand the business challenges behind the marketing challenges. And you don't think I can do that effectively within the agency structure. I think you could do it much more effectively outside of it. No offense to Lisa, but watching her try to manage strategic relationships that you've built over years She's good at presenting ideas, but she doesn't have your depth of understanding or your ability to develop truly innovative approaches. There it was. Tom had seen through the carefully constructed facade of Lisa's leadership role. He understood that the strategic value he'd been receiving had come from me, not from whoever was officially designated as the account lead. This is a lot to process, Tom. Can I think about it? Of course, take all the time you need. But Jennifer, I want you to know that this isn't just about one client relationship. I think you have the potential to build something really significant in the consulting space. You have the expertise, the track record, and the client relationships to make it work. After we ended the call, I sat at my desk staring at my computer screen without really seeing it. Around me, the office continued its normal rhythm. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing, conversations about campaign deadlines and client meetings. But I felt like I was observing it all from a distance, as if I'd already begun the process of stepping outside the world I'd inhabited for 8 years. That evening, I found myself in Michael Tran's office again, but this time the conversation felt different. Instead of seeking advice about how to navigate the Lisa situation, I was exploring the possibility of transcending it entirely. Independent consulting, Michael said, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. It's not without risks, but it could be exactly what you need. What do you think the risks are? The obvious ones: irregular income, the challenge of business development, the loss of institutional support. But there are also less obvious risks, like losing the collaborative energy that comes from working with a team, or the isolation of working independently. I nodded, but as Michael listed the potential downsides, I found myself thinking about the upside. No more watching Lisa take credit for my work. No more being relegated to client maintenance while others led strategic initiatives. No more navigating the complex politics of agency hierarchy. On the other hand, Michael continued, you'd have complete control over your professional reputation. You'd work directly with clients who value your expertise. And you'd be able to develop and implement strategies without having to filter them through multiple layers of agency bureaucracy. What do you think I should do? Michael smiled. I think you should do what you've been doing. Gather information, build relationships, and position yourself for whatever decision you ultimately make. But Jennifer, I also think you should seriously consider this opportunity. You've been undervalued here for too long, and you have the talent and experience to succeed independently. Over the next few days, I found myself paying closer attention to the dynamics within the agency, but with a different perspective. Instead of seeing Lisa as someone I needed to outmaneuver within the existing system, I began to see her as someone whose success was dependent on a system that I might not need to remain part of. I also began to see the limitations of the agency structure itself. The need to maintain hierarchies and protect egos often prevented the best strategic thinking from reaching clients. The pressure to appear innovative sometimes led to solutions that were more about impressive presentations than effective results. Most significantly, I began to see that my value wasn't tied to my position within Meridian's organizational chart. The relationships I'd built, the expertise I'd developed, the strategic frameworks I'd created, these things belonged to me, not to the agency. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. 3 days after Tom's initial call, he reached out again with more specific details about the consulting opportunity. He'd spoken with his colleagues, and they were prepared to offer me a 6-month contract that would provide more income than my current salary, while allowing me to work with multiple clients on high-level strategic projects. The timing might actually be perfect, Tom. We're entering our major planning cycle for next year, and having dedicated strategic support could make a huge difference in how we approach our market positioning. As I listened to Tom describe the scope of work and the collaborative approach he envisioned, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine excitement about a professional opportunity. This wasn't about proving my worth within someone else's system. This was about building something new, something that would be entirely mine. That night I called my sister Sarah, who lived in Portland and worked as a freelance marketing consultant. I've been waiting for this call for months, she said after I explained the situation. You've been too good for that place for years, and it sounds like they've finally pushed you to the point where you're ready to do something about it. I'm scared, I admitted. 8 years is a long time to walk away from. 8 years is also a long time to invest in building expertise that you can take anywhere. Jennifer, you're not walking away from 8 years of work, you're walking toward the next phase of your career. By the end of our conversation, I knew what I was going to do. I wasn't ready to tell Tom yes immediately, but I was ready to start planning for a future that didn't include Lisa's credit claiming, or Darren's benign neglect, or the slow erosion of my professional identity. I was ready to start building something that would be entirely mine. The week following Tom's consulting offer felt like living in two different realities simultaneously. In one reality, I continued showing up to Meridian Creative, attending meetings, collaborating on campaigns, and maintaining the professional facade I'd perfected over the past few months. In the other reality, I was quietly architecting my escape, building the foundation for a consulting practice that would allow me to reclaim control over my career. The tension between these two realities created an odd sense of clarity. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to Lisa's moves or feeling frustrated by Darren's oversight. Instead, I was observing the agency's dynamics with the detached perspective of someone who was already mentally preparing to leave. This shift in mindset became apparent during our weekly strategy meeting on Tuesday morning. Lisa was presenting her vision for Q4 client acquisition, using language and frameworks that I recognized from conversations we'd had months earlier. But instead of feeling the familiar sting of watching her claim credit for my thinking, I found myself studying her presentation style, noting the gaps between her confident delivery and her actual understanding of the strategic concepts she was discussing. The key to scaling our client relationships, Lisa said, clicking through slides that featured charts I'd helped her create, is to focus on value-driven partnerships that align with our core competencies. Alice Reed raised her hand. Can you elaborate on what you mean by value-driven partnerships? How does that translate into specific client engagement strategies? I watched Lisa's momentary pause, the slight tightening around her eyes, that indicated she was about to improvise an answer to a question she hadn't anticipated. It was the same expression I'd seen when Sarah Chen had pressed her for details about hotel industry booking patterns. Well, Lisa began, it's about creating synergies that maximize mutual benefit while maintaining strategic flexibility. The answer was pure corporate speak, devoid of actual strategic thinking. I could see Alice's expression shift from interest to polite confusion, and I realized that Lisa's limitations were becoming visible to people beyond just me. Without thinking, I found myself speaking up. What Lisa's describing aligns with the tiered engagement model I've been developing for our higher value clients. The key is matching the intensity of our strategic involvement with the client's operational complexity and growth trajectory. Lisa turned to me with a smile that looked appreciative but felt sharp around the edges. Exactly. Jennifer's always so good at translating strategic concepts into practical framework. But Alice's attention had shifted to me entirely. Jennifer, can you walk us through this tiered engagement model? It sounds like something we should be implementing more systematically. For the next 10 minutes, I explained a client engagement strategy I'd been refining over the past year, one that categorized clients based on their strategic sophistication and tailored our service approach accordingly. It was work that Lisa had never seen, concepts she couldn't claim credit for, thinking that demonstrated exactly why clients like Tom valued my expertise. The room was engaged in a way they hadn't been during Lisa's presentation. People were taking notes, asking follow-up questions, and building on the framework in real time. It felt like the kind of collaborative strategic thinking that had drawn me to agency work in the first place. After the meeting, Alice approached my desk with an expression that was both impressed and concerned. Jennifer, that engagement model you described is exactly the kind of thinking we need to be leading with. Why haven't I seen this before? It was a loaded question. The honest answer was that I'd been developing advanced strategic frameworks, while Lisa had been claiming credit for my more basic work. But saying that would sound like professional jealousy. I've been testing it with a few select clients to refine the approach, I said. I wanted to make sure it was solid before presenting it more broadly. Alice nodded, but I could see her mental wheels turning. She was beginning to understand that there was a gap between Lisa's public role and the source of our team's strategic thinking. I'd like to schedule some time with you to go deeper on this, Alice said. We should be leveraging this kind of innovation across all our client relationships. That afternoon, I received an email from Darren's assistant requesting a meeting for the following day. The subject line simply read, "Strategic Planning Discussion." I stared at the email for several minutes, trying to interpret its meaning. Was this about the engagement model I'd presented? Was Darren finally recognizing my contribution? Or was this part of some larger restructuring that would further marginalize my role? Emily Fields appeared at my desk with a worried expression. "Hey, did you get a meeting request from Darren too?" My stomach dropped. "You did?" "Yeah, and so did Lisa. And Mike, it seems like he's having individual meetings with all the senior strategic staff." This felt ominous. Darren rarely conducted one-on-one meetings unless there were significant changes coming. The timing, just days after Tom's consulting offer, felt like the universe was forcing me to make a decision sooner than I'd anticipated. That evening, I called Tom to give him a preliminary answer about the consulting opportunity. "I'm very interested," I told him, "but I need to understand what's happening at my current position before I can commit to a timeline." Tom was understanding. "Of course, take whatever time you need. But Jennifer, I should mention that my colleagues and I have been discussing the scope of work, and we're even more excited about the possibilities than we were initially. This could be the foundation for something really significant." After we ended the call, I spent the evening reviewing my contract with Meridian, my client relationships, and my financial situation. If I was going to make the leap to independent consulting, I needed to be prepared for all the practical implications. The most important preparation, though, was mental. I needed to shift from thinking like someone who was trying to succeed within Meridian's structure to thinking like someone who was building her own professional future. The next morning, I arrived at the office with a different kind of confidence. I wasn't nervous about Darren's meeting or concerned about Lisa's latest strategic presentation. I was curious about what opportunities might emerge and how I could position myself for whatever came next. Lisa was in Darren's office when I arrived, and through the glass walls I could see an animated conversation taking place. Lisa's body language suggested she was excited about something, while Darren's expression was characteristically difficult to read. When Lisa emerged 20 minutes later, she looked pleased but also slightly stressed, like someone who'd been given a significant opportunity along with significant pressure. "How did it go?" I asked, maintaining my supportive colleague demeanor. "Really well," Lisa said, but her smile seemed forced. "Darren's got some big plans for the strategic team." An hour later, I was sitting across from Darren in his corner office, surrounded by the awards and recognition that Meridian had accumulated over its 10 years of operation. Many of those awards represented campaigns I'd worked on, strategies I'd developed, client relationships I'd built. "Jennifer," Darren began, "I want to talk to you about the future of our strategic operation." For the next 30 minutes, Darren outlined his vision for restructuring the agency's strategic functions. Lisa would be promoted to Director of Strategic Development, leading business development and new client acquisition. I would become Director of Strategic Operations, focusing on client retention and campaign optimization. On the surface, it sounded like a promotion. Both Lisa and I would have director titles, expanded responsibilities, and increased visibility within the agency. But as Darren described the role divisions, I realized what was actually happening. Lisa would get the glamorous work, pitching new clients, developing innovative campaign concepts, representing the agency at industry events. I would get the operational work, managing existing relationships, troubleshooting campaign problems, ensuring that Lisa's bold promises were actually delivered. It was a formalization of the dynamic that had been developing for months. Lisa would be the face of our strategic thinking, while I would be the engine that made it actually work. "This structure plays to both of your strengths," Darren said. "Lisa's got the vision and presentation skills for business development, while you've got the operational expertise and client relationships for delivery." I nodded and asked thoughtful questions about reporting structures and resource allocation, but internally I was processing the larger implications. Darren was offering me a promotion that was actually a demotion, a recognition that was actually a relegation. Most importantly, he was making it clear that my future at Meridian would always be secondary to Lisa's, regardless of my contributions or capabilities. "I'd like some time to consider the details," I said finally. "Of course," Darren replied, "but I'm hoping to announce the new structure next week, so if you could let me know your thoughts by Friday, that would be great." As I walked back to my desk, I felt a strange sense of relief. Darren had just made my decision much easier. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp Seattle weather that usually energized me, but I felt disconnected from everything around me as I walked into Meridian's sleek lobby. I had until the end of the day to give Darren my answer about the Director of Strategic Operations role, but the decision had crystallized the moment he'd outlined his vision for my future. I wasn't going to accept a promotion that was designed to keep me in Lisa's shadow permanently. The morning began with our standard team meeting, but the energy in the room felt different. Word had gotten out about the restructuring, and people were positioning themselves around what they perceived as the new power dynamics. I watched colleagues, who had worked with me for years, suddenly deferring to Lisa on decisions that would have come to me just months earlier. Emily Fields, who had always looked to me for guidance, was now directing her questions to Lisa. When I offered input on a campaign strategy, the conversation moved forward as if I hadn't spoken. It was like watching myself become professionally invisible in real time. The breaking point came during the presentation of our Q4 client retention strategy. Lisa stood at the front of the room, clicking through slides that featured the tiered engagement model I'd developed and presented just days earlier. But she was presenting it as her own strategic framework, complete with a new name, the Rodriguez Client Evolution Matrix. "I've been developing this approach for several months," Lisa said, her voice carrying the confident tone of someone who believed her own fiction. "It's based on extensive analysis of client behavior patterns and engagement optimization strategy." I felt something shift inside me, a cold clarity that cut through months of careful patience and strategic diplomacy. This wasn't just credit theft anymore. This was professional identity theft, the systematic appropriation of my intellectual property and strategic thinking. Alice Reed, who had specifically asked me about this framework just days earlier, was taking notes and nodding appreciatively. The rest of the team was engaged and impressed, discussing implementation strategies for Lisa's innovative approach to client management. When the meeting ended, I walked directly to my desk and opened my laptop. Instead of continuing to play the supportive colleague, I began documenting everything. I pulled up the original files where I'd developed the engagement model, complete with timestamps and version history. I gathered emails where I'd discussed the framework with clients, including detailed conversations with Tom about implementation strategies. Within an hour, I had assembled a comprehensive record of my intellectual property that Lisa had just claimed as her own. But more importantly, I had absolute clarity about what I needed to do next. I called Tom from the privacy of an empty conference room. "I'm ready to accept your consulting offer," I said without preamble. Tom's excitement was immediate. "That's fantastic news. What changed your mind?" I gave him a brief overview of the morning's events and Darren's proposed restructuring. Tom listened with growing concern and then anger. "Jennifer, what you're describing is exactly why we need to work together direct. You've been developing sophisticated strategic thinking that's getting filtered through people who don't understand it, or apparently, who are willing to take credit for it." We spent the next 30 minutes discussing practical details. Start date, contract terms, initial project scope. Tom had already spoken with his colleagues and they were prepared to move forward immediately. The financial terms were better than I'd hoped, and the scope of work was exactly the kind of high-level strategic consulting I'd always wanted to do. "There's one more thing," Tom said as our conversation was winding down. "I've been talking to Marcus Webb at Cascade Dynamics. They're looking for strategic consulting support for a major rebranding initiative. If you're interested, this could be the foundation for a really substantial consulting practice." By the time I ended the call, I had the framework for a new career that would begin in 3 weeks. I would finish out my current projects at Meridian, transition my client relationships appropriately, and then step into a consulting role that would give me complete control over my professional future. But first, I had one final conversation to have with Darren. I scheduled a meeting for late afternoon, after the office had emptied out enough to ensure privacy. When I walked into Darren's office, he looked up with the expectant expression of someone who assumed I was there to accept his offer. "Jennifer, I'm hoping you've had a chance to consider the Director of Strategic Operations position. I think it could be a great fit for your skills and interests." I sat down across from his desk and took a breath. "Darren, I appreciate the offer, but I won't be accepting the position. In fact, I'll be leaving Meridian at the end of the month." The change in his expression was immediate and dramatic. Surprise, then concern, then what looked like panic as he began to process the implications. "Leaving? Jennifer, what's prompted this decision? If it's about the title or the compensation package, we can certainly discuss adjustments." "It's not about compensation or titles," I said calmly. "It's about the direction of my career and the kind of work I want to be doing." I explained that I'd accepted a consulting opportunity that would allow me to work directly with clients on high-level strategic initiatives. I was diplomatic about my reasons for leaving, focusing on professional growth, rather than the toxic dynamics that had actually driven my decision. Darren listened with growing agitation. "Jennifer, you understand that losing you would be a significant blow to our strategic capabilities. You've been instrumental in building several of our key client relationships." "I understand that, and I'm committed to ensuring a smooth transition. I'll work with Lisa and the team to transfer my client knowledge and project responsibilities." At the mention of Lisa's name, something shifted in Darren's expression. I could see him beginning to understand the implications of promoting Lisa while losing me. He was about to discover the difference between someone who could present strategic thinking and someone who could actually develop it. "Is there anything we can do to change your mind?" he asked. "A different role structure, more autonomy, a significant compensation increase." For a brief moment, I considered what it would mean to negotiate from this position of strength. Darren was clearly panicked about losing me, which meant he finally understood my value to the agency. I could probably secure a much better arrangement, more recognition, protection from Lisa's credit claiming. But then I thought about Tom's excitement about our collaboration, about the consulting opportunities that were already materializing, about the freedom to work directly with clients who valued sophisticated strategic thinking. "I appreciate the offer to negotiate," I said, "but I've already committed to the consulting opportunity, and I'm excited about the work we'll be doing." Darren spent the next 20 minutes trying various approaches to change my mind. Appeals to loyalty, promises of future opportunities, concerns about the risks of independent consulting. But his arguments only reinforced my decision. He was treating my departure as a problem to be solved rather than recognizing the systemic issues that had driven me to leave. When it became clear that I wasn't going to change my mind, Darren's tone shifted to damage control. "How do we handle this with the team? And more importantly, how do we handle this with your clients?" "I'll work with you and Lisa to develop transition plans for each of my client relationships," I said. "My goal is to ensure that Meridian's service quality doesn't suffer during the handover." But even as I said it, I knew that the transition would reveal exactly how much of the strategic depth Lisa had been claiming credit for had actually come from me. That evening, I sat in my apartment looking out at the Seattle skyline, feeling a mixture of excitement and relief that I hadn't experienced in months. I'd finally stopped playing defense against Lisa's political maneuvering and started playing offense for my own career. The next 3 weeks would be challenging, but they would also be liberating. For the first time in months, I wasn't trying to prove my worth within someone else's system. I was building my own system, one where my strategic thinking would be valued and my contributions would be recognized. Most importantly, I would never again have to watch someone else take credit for work that was fundamentally mine. The news of my departure spread through Meridian's office like a controlled wildfire. By Monday morning, everyone knew that I was leaving for an independent consulting opportunity, and the reactions ranged from surprise to concern to barely concealed panic from people who understood how much of the agency's strategic thinking had come from me. Lisa's reaction was the most interesting to observe. When Darren announced my departure during the morning team meeting, I watched her face cycle through several emotions: surprise, calculation, and then what looked like relief. She probably thought my exit would eliminate the one person who knew exactly how much credit she'd been claiming for work she hadn't done. But as the week progressed and the reality of managing client relationships without my strategic support became apparent, Lisa's confidence began to crack. It started with small things. Client calls where she couldn't answer detailed questions about campaign rationale. Strategy sessions where she relied heavily on frameworks I'd developed, but couldn't explain the underlying logic. Presentations that looked polished on the surface but lacked the strategic depth that clients had come to expect. The most revealing moment came during a crisis management call with Evergreen Hospitality. Sarah Chen had called with concerns about their upcoming fall campaign, specifically questioning whether the messaging strategy would resonate with their target demographic during the shoulder season. I listened to Lisa's response from my desk, since I was still officially involved in the transition process. Lisa's answer was generic and unhelpful, filled with marketing buzzwords but lacking any real understanding of the hospitality industry's seasonal dynamic. After 15 minutes of increasingly frustrated questions from Sarah, Lisa finally said, "Let me get Jennifer on the call. She's been so instrumental in developing our understanding of your business model." When I joined the conversation, Sarah's relief was audible. "Jennifer, thank goodness. I need someone who understands the operational challenges we're facing." For the next 20 minutes, I walked Sarah through a strategic approach that addressed her specific concerns about seasonal messaging and demographic targeting. It was the kind of detailed, industry-specific strategic thinking that Lisa had never bothered to develop, even though she'd been claiming credit for its results for months. After the call ended, Lisa and I found ourselves in one of the small conference rooms, ostensibly to discuss the transition plan but actually to address the elephant in the room. "That was great work on the Sarah call," Lisa said, her tone carefully neutral. "I'm really going to miss having your expertise to draw on." I looked at her across the conference table, this woman who had spent months systematically appropriating my work and positioning herself as the strategic leader of our team. For the first time since this whole situation had begun, I decided to address it directly. "Lisa," I said quietly, "I think we should talk honestly about what's been happening over the past few months." Her expression shifted slightly, wariness replacing the practiced professional smile. "What do you mean?" "I mean the way you've been presenting my strategic frameworks as your own work. The way you've taken credit for campaigns I developed. The way you've positioned yourself as the source of strategic thinking that actually came from me." Lisa's face went through several changes: surprise, defensiveness, and then a calculation as she tried to determine how to respond. "I think you're misremembering how collaborative our work has been," she said finally. "We've all contributed to the team's success." "Lisa, this morning you presented the Rodriguez Client Evolution Matrix, which is the tiered engagement model I developed and presented last week. You literally gave it a new name and claimed it as your innovation." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Lisa was clearly trying to decide whether to continue denying the obvious or to shift to a different strategy. "Jennifer," she said finally, "I think you've been under a lot of stress lately, and maybe that's affecting how you remember our collaboration." It was a masterful deflection, suggesting that my concerns were the result of stress-induced confusion rather than legitimate grievances about credit theft. But I was past the point where Lisa's political maneuvering could affect me. "I have documentation," I said calmly. "Timestamps on strategic frameworks, email trails showing the development of campaign concepts, client feedback specifically referencing my contributions. If you want to discuss collaboration, we can review the actual record of who developed what." Lisa's composure finally cracked slightly. "Look, Jennifer, I don't know what you think you're proving here. We're all part of a team, and team success belongs to everyone." "Team success does belong to everyone," I agreed, "but individual contributions should be acknowledged appropriately, and strategic frameworks that I developed independently shouldn't be rebranded and presented as someone else's innovation." I could see Lisa processing the implications of this conversation. She was beginning to understand that I wasn't just leaving quietly. I was leaving with a clear understanding of what had been happening, and the evidence to support it. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally. It was the first honest question she'd asked in months, and it deserved an honest answer. "I don't want anything from you, Lisa. I'm leaving, remember. This conversation isn't about what I want, it's about making sure we both understand what's been happening so we can handle the transition professionally." "And what do you think has been happening?" "I think you've been building your career on strategic thinking that you didn't develop. I think you've been claiming credit for work that required expertise you don't possess. And I think the next few months are going to reveal the difference between someone who can present strategic concepts and someone who can actually create them." Lisa's face hardened. "That sounds like a threat." "It's not a threat," I said. "It's an observation. Client relationships are built on strategic depth and consistent value delivery. When clients can't get the level of thinking they've come to expect, they notice." I gathered my notes and stood to leave. "I genuinely hope you succeed, Lisa, but I also hope you understand that success in strategic consulting requires more than presentation skills and political maneuvering." As I walked back to my desk, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete clarity about my professional situation. I wasn't angry or vindictive. I was simply done with the dynamics that had been constraining my career and ready to move forward. The rest of the week was spent in transition meetings with clients, project handovers with team members, and documentation of strategic frameworks that would remain with the agency. But the most significant conversation was with Emily Fields, who approached my desk on Thursday afternoon with a concerned expression. "Jennifer, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course. Are you leaving because of Lisa?" It was a direct question that deserved a thoughtful answer. Emily was young and observant, and she'd been watching the team dynamics with the kind of attention that comes from trying to understand how to navigate office politics successfully. "I'm leaving because I have an opportunity to do work that excites me. But Emily, I want you to understand something about professional relationships and credit attribution." For the next 20 minutes, I explained to Emily the importance of documenting her contributions, advocating for appropriate recognition, and building direct relationships with clients and colleagues. I didn't criticize Lisa directly, but I gave Emily the tools to protect herself from similar situations. "The most important thing," I concluded, "is to never let someone else define your professional worth. You know what you contribute, and you should make sure other people know it too." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "I've been watching what's been happening, and I've been learning a lot about how agencies really work." "What have you been learning?" "That talent isn't always enough, that politics matter, but also that people like you eventually find a way to succeed regardless of the obstacles." On Friday, my last day at Meridian, I cleaned out my desk and said goodbye to colleagues who had become friends over 8 years of shared projects and professional challenges. Michael Tran stopped by in the afternoon with a bottle of champagne and a knowing smile. "This isn't really goodbye," he said. "This is the beginning of the next chapter." "I hope so, Jennifer. I've been in this industry for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of talented people get sidelined by politics and ego, but I've also seen exceptional people find ways to transcend those limitations and build something better. You're going to be fine." As I walked out of Meridian's office for the last time, carrying a box of personal items and a portfolio of strategic frameworks that would form the foundation of my consulting practice, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Excitement about Monday morning. For the first time in my career, I would be working entirely for myself, with clients who valued sophisticated strategic thinking and understood the difference between presentation and substance. Lisa could have the agency politics and the credit claiming, and the constant navigation of interpersonal dynamics. I was going to build something better. 3 weeks into my consulting practice, I was working from a small office space in Pioneer Square, surrounded by strategic frameworks, client research, and the kind of deep analytical work that had drawn me to marketing in the first place. The transition had been smoother than I'd hoped. Tom's project was proceeding ahead of schedule. Marcus Webb at Cascade Dynamics had signed a 6-month strategic consulting contract, and I'd received inquiries from 2 other companies that had heard about my work through industry connection. But the real validation came in the form of phone calls from former colleagues and industry contacts who were witnessing the aftermath of my departure from Meridian. The first call was from Kate Thompson in HR, who reached out under the pretense of completing exit interview documentation, but actually wanted to understand what was happening with our former client. "Jennifer, I hope you don't mind me calling, but we're getting some concerning feedback from a few key accounts. Evergreen Hospitality specifically requested to work with you directly, and when we explained that you'd left, they expressed serious concerns about continuity of service." I wasn't surprised. Sarah Chen had called me directly the week after I left, asking if I would be willing to consult with them independently. I declined, suggesting they work with Meridian for a transition period, but I could sense her frustration with the gap between my strategic approach and whatever Lisa was providing. "I hope the transition is going smoothly," I said diplomatically. "That's just it," Kate continued. "It's not going smoothly. Lisa is struggling to maintain the level of strategic depth that clients have come to expect, and Darren is starting to realize that promoting her while losing you might have been a miscalculation." The second call came from Emily Fields, who sounded stressed and overwhelmed. "Jennifer, I know you're not supposed to be involved anymore, but I'm having trouble with the Pacific Northwest tech account. Tom keeps asking questions about strategic frameworks that I don't understand, and Lisa's answers aren't helping." This was exactly what I'd anticipated. Tom had been polite about the transition, but he'd also made it clear that he expected the same level of strategic sophistication he'd been receiving. Lisa's inability to provide that depth was becoming apparent quickly. "Emily, what specific questions is Tom asking?" "He wants to understand the rationale behind the Q4 campaign approach, specifically how it connects to the engagement model you developed. Lisa keeps talking about synergies and optimization, but Tom says it's not addressing his operational concern." I spent 30 minutes walking Emily through the strategic logic behind the campaign framework, explaining how it connected to Pacific Northwest Tech's business model and market position. It was work that Lisa should have been able to handle if she'd actually understood the strategic thinking rather than just presenting it. "Emily," I said as our conversation was ending, "document everything we discussed today, and make sure Lisa understands the client's concerns clearly. This isn't about undermining anyone, it's about ensuring client success." But the most revealing call came from Alice Reed, who reached out 3 weeks after I'd left. "Jennifer, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. How much of our team's strategic thinking was actually coming from you?" It was the question I'd been expecting for months, but hearing it from Alice still felt significant. She was finally seeing what I'd been living with: the gap between Lisa's public role and her actual capability. "Alice, I think that's something you should discuss with Lisa and Darren. My focus now is on building my consulting practice. I understand your discretion, but Jennifer, we're facing some serious challenges. 3 clients have expressed concerns about strategic depth, and Lisa is struggling to maintain the level of thinking they've come to expect. Darren is asking me to evaluate our strategic capabilities, and I need to understand what we've lost." I gave Alice a diplomatic but honest assessment of the situation. I explained that strategic consulting required deep industry knowledge, analytical rigor, and the ability to translate complex business challenges into actionable framework. I suggested that the agency might need to invest in additional strategic talent or reconsider how they structured their client service model. "What you're describing," Alice said, "sounds like capabilities that we had when you were here but seem to have lost." "Strategic thinking isn't something that can be easily replaced," I said. "It requires years of experience, continuous learning, and genuine understanding of business dynamics." The conversation with Alice was followed by an email from Darren himself, requesting a meeting to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. I declined politely, explaining that my consulting practice was focused on direct client relationships rather than agency partnership. But the email revealed something important. Meridian was beginning to understand the cost of my departure. This was confirmed a week later when Tom called with an update on his experience with Meridian's transition efforts. "Jennifer, I need to tell you something. Lisa is a nice person, and she's clearly trying, but she doesn't understand our business the way you did. The strategic recommendations she's making are generic and don't address our specific challenge. Tom went on to explain that Pacific Northwest Tech was considering ending their relationship with Meridian and working with me directly for their strategic consulting needs. I don't want to put you in an awkward position, he said, but we need the level of thinking you were providing, and we're not getting it from the current arrangement. I was careful in my response, not wanting to actively undermine Meridian while also being honest about my capability. Tom, I appreciate your confidence in my work. If you do decide to make a change, I'd be happy to discuss how we might work together directly, but I'd encourage you to give Meridian a fair opportunity to meet your needs. Tom's call was followed by similar conversations with two other former clients who were experiencing the same gap between expectations and delivery. Word was spreading through the industry that the strategic thinking behind some of Meridian's most successful campaigns had walked out the door with me. The most satisfying moment came 6 weeks after my departure, when Emily Fields called with news from the agency. Jennifer, you should know that Darren has hired 2 new senior strategists. He's also restructured Lisa's role to focus more on business development and less on strategic delivery. How is Lisa handling that? She seems relieved actually. I think she was feeling overwhelmed by the client expectations and the technical requirements of strategic consulting. She's much better at the relationship side of things. What Emily was describing was exactly what I'd observed for months. Lisa was skilled at networking and presentation, but lacked the analytical depth required for sophisticated strategic thinking. Darren had finally recognized this distinction, but only after losing several clients and realizing that presentation skills couldn't replace strategic substance. There's something else, Emily continued. Darren asked me to reach out to you about a potential consulting arrangement. He wants to know if you'd be interested in working with Meridian on specific projects that require advanced strategic thinking. I almost laughed. Darren was essentially asking me to provide the strategic capabilities that he'd thought Lisa could replace, but on a freelance basis without the recognition or institutional support I'd been seeking. Emily, please tell Darren that I appreciate the inquiry, but my consulting practice is focused on direct client relationships. I'm not interested in subcontracting arrangements. Look, Jennifer, I don't know what you think you're proving here. We're all part of a team, and team success belongs to everyone. Team success does belong to everyone. I agreed, but individual contributions should be acknowledged appropriately, and strategic frameworks that I developed independently shouldn't be rebranded and presented as someone else's innovation. I could see Lisa processing the implications of this conversation. She was beginning to understand that I wasn't just leaving quietly. I was leaving with a clear understanding of what had been happening and the evidence to support it. What do you want from me? She asked. Finally, it was the first honest question she'd asked in months, and it deserved an honest answer. I don't want anything from you, Lisa. I'm leaving. Remember, this conversation isn't about what I want. It's about making sure we both understand what's been happening so we can handle the transition professionally. And what do you think has been happening? I think you've been building your career on strategic thinking that you didn't develop. I think you've been claiming credit for work that required expertise you don't possess. And I think the next few months are going to reveal the difference between someone who can present strategic concepts and someone who can actually create them. Lisa's face hardened. That sounds like a threat. It's not a threat, I said. It's an observation. Client relationships are built on strategic depth and consistent value delivery. When clients can't get the level of thinking they've come to expect, they notice. I gathered my notes and stood to leave. I genuinely hope you succeed, Lisa, but I also hope you understand that success in strategic consulting requires more than presentation skills and political maneuvering. As I walked back to my desk, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete clarity about my professional situation. I wasn't angry or vindictive. I was simply done with the dynamics that had been constraining my career and ready to move forward. The rest of the week was spent in transition meetings with clients, project handovers with team members, and documentation of strategic frameworks that would remain with the agency. But the most significant conversation was with Emily Fields, who approached my desk on Thursday afternoon with a concerned expression. "Jennifer, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course. Are you leaving because of Lisa?" It was a direct question that deserved a thoughtful answer. Emily was young and observant, and she'd been watching the team dynamics with the kind of attention that comes from trying to understand how to navigate office politics successfully. "I'm leaving because I have an opportunity to do work that excites me," I said. "But Emily, I want you to understand something about professional relationships and credit attribution." For the next 20 minutes, I explained to Emily the importance of documenting her contributions, advocating for appropriate recognition, and building direct relationships with clients and colleagues. I didn't criticize Lisa directly, but I gave Emily the tools to protect herself from similar situations. "The most important thing," I concluded, "is to never let someone else define your professional worth. You know what you contribute, and you should make sure other people know it too." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "I've been watching what's been happening, and I've been learning a lot about how agencies really work." "What have you been learning?" "That talent isn't always enough. That politics matter, but also that people like you eventually find a way to succeed, regardless of the obstacles." On Friday, my last day at Meridian, I cleaned out my desk and said goodbye to colleagues who had become friends over 8 years of shared projects and professional challenge. Michael Tran stopped by in the afternoon with a bottle of champagne and a knowing smile. "This isn't really goodbye," he said. "This is the beginning of the next chapter. I hope so." "Jennifer, I've been in this industry for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of talented people get sidelined by politics and ego. But I've also seen exceptional people find ways to transcend those limitations and build something better. You're going to be fine." As I walked out of Meridian's office for the last time, carrying a box of personal items and a portfolio of strategic frameworks that would form the foundation of my consulting practice, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: excitement about Monday morning. For the first time in my career, I would be working entirely for myself, with clients who valued sophisticated strategic thinking and understood the difference between presentation and substance. Lisa could have the agency politics and the credit claiming, and the constant navigation of interpersonal dynamics. I was going to build something better. 3 weeks into my consulting practice, I was working from a small office space in Pioneer Square, surrounded by strategic frameworks, client research, and the kind of deep analytical work that had drawn me to marketing in the first place. The transition had been smoother than I'd hoped. Tom's project was proceeding ahead of schedule. Marcus Webb, at Cascade Dynamics, had signed a 6-month strategic consulting contract, and I'd received inquiries from 2 other companies that had heard about my work through industry connection. But the real validation came in the form of phone calls from former colleagues and industry contacts who were witnessing the aftermath of my departure from Meridian. The first call was from Kate Thompson in HR, who reached out under the pretense of completing exit interview documentation but actually wanted to understand what was happening with our former client. "Jennifer, I hope you don't mind me calling, but we're getting some concerning feedback from a few key accounts. Evergreen Hospitality specifically requested to work with you directly, and when we explained that you'd left, they expressed serious concerns about continuity of service." After I ended the call, I sat in my office looking out at Elliott Bay, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. 6 months earlier, I'd been struggling to get recognition for my contributions within Meridian's structure. Now I had clients calling directly, industry colleagues, referring new business, and the freedom to work on strategic challenges that genuinely excited me. Lisa had succeeded in the short term, using political maneuvering and credit claiming to advance her career within the agency structure. But her success had been built on a foundation she couldn't sustain once the source of her strategic content was no longer available. Meanwhile, I'd discovered that my value wasn't tied to any particular organization or hierarchy. The strategic thinking, client relationships, and industry expertise I'd developed belonged to me, and I could leverage them more effectively as an independent consultant than I ever had as an agency employee. The final validation came in the form of a LinkedIn message from Tom. "Jennifer, I wanted you to know that the strategic framework you developed for us has become a model that we're sharing with other companies in our industry. Your thinking has had impact far beyond our individual campaign. Thank you for the exceptional work." As I read Tom's message, I realized that this was the recognition I'd been seeking all along. Acknowledgement that my strategic thinking had real value, that my contributions made a meaningful difference, and that my expertise was worth seeking out and compensating appropriately. Lisa could keep the agency politics and the presentation opportunities, and the director title. I'd found something better: professional autonomy, intellectual respect, and the satisfaction of building something entirely my own. 6 months after leaving Meridian Creative, I found myself in a position I'd never quite imagined possible. My consulting practice had grown from Tom's initial project to a portfolio of 8 clients, each seeking the kind of sophisticated strategic thinking that had been undervalued at the agency. More importantly, I was working on challenges that stretched my capabilities and reminded me why I'd fallen in love with strategic marketing in the first place. The morning that truly marked my transformation began with a call from Marcus Webb at Cascade Dynamics. We'd been working together for 4 months on a comprehensive rebranding initiative, and the results were exceeding everyone's expectations. "Jennifer, I have some news that I think will interest you," Marcus said, his voice carrying an excitement that immediately caught my attention. "The board just approved our Q1 budget, and they want to expand our strategic consulting relationship significantly." I was sitting in my Pioneer Square office, surrounded by whiteboards, covered in strategic frameworks and client research. The space had evolved from a temporary solution to a genuine strategic thinking laboratory, complete with industry reports, competitive analyses, and the kind of deep analytical tools that allowed for sophisticated strategic development. "What kind of expansion are you thinking about?" I asked. "We want to retain you as our primary strategic advisor for the next 18 months, full market positioning review, competitive landscape analysis, and strategic planning for our expansion into 3 new market segments." The scope Marcus was describing represented more revenue than I'd made in my last 2 years at Meridian, but more importantly, it represented the kind of comprehensive strategic work that I'd always wanted to do. This wasn't about managing existing campaigns or optimizing someone else's frameworks. This was about building strategy from the ground up. "Marcus, that sounds like exactly the kind of challenge I'm looking for. There's one more thing," he continued. "We'd like you to present your strategic recommendations to our board of directors next month. They're specifically interested in your analytical approach and how it differs from traditional agency thinking." After ending the call with Marcus, I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the growth trajectory of my consulting practice. What had started as an escape from Lisa's credit claiming had evolved into something much more significant: a platform for the kind of strategic thinking that had been constrained by agency politics and hierarchical limitation. The contrast with my former situation became even clearer when Emily Fields called that afternoon with an update from Meridian. "Jennifer, I wanted you to know that Pacific Northwest Tech officially ended their contract with us last week. Tom said the strategic support wasn't meeting their needs, and they've decided to work with independent consultants moving forward." I wasn't surprised. Tom had been diplomatic about the transition, but I'd sensed his growing frustration with the gap between what he needed and what Lisa could provide. "How is the team handling the client losses?" I asked. "It's been challenging," Emily admitted. "We've lost 3 major accounts in the past 2 months, all citing concerns about strategic depth. Darren has hired 2 new senior strategists, but they're still trying to understand client needs that you'd been managing for years." Emily went on to explain that Lisa had been moved into a pure business development role, focusing on new client acquisition rather than strategic delivery. It was a face-saving restructure that acknowledged what everyone had come to understand. Lisa's skills were in relationship building and presentation, not in the analytical thinking required for sophisticated strategic consulting. "There's something else," Emily continued. "Alice asked me to tell you that several clients have specifically asked about working with you directly. She wanted to know if you'd be interested in a partnership arrangement where Meridian would refer clients to your practice. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months after being relegated to client maintenance while Lisa handled strategic leadership, Meridian was essentially asking me to provide the strategic capabilities they'd lost when I left. Emily, please tell Alice that I appreciate the inquiry, but my practice is focused on direct client relationships. I'm not interested in referral arrangements with agencies. That evening, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The transition from agency strategist to independent consultant hadn't just been about escaping Lisa's credit claiming or Darren's organizational blindness. It had been about discovering that my most valuable professional asset wasn't my position within someone else's hierarchy, but rather the strategic thinking capabilities I'd developed over years of solving complex business challenges. The validation of this realization came in unexpected ways. Industry colleagues who had known me from my Meridian days were referring new clients. Strategic frameworks I'd developed were being implemented by companies across different sectors. Most significantly, clients were seeking me out specifically because of my reputation for analytical depth and innovative thinking. The most meaningful recognition came from Tom, who had become not just a client, but a genuine advocate for my work. During one of our monthly strategy sessions, he made a comment that crystallized everything I'd been learning about professional value and recognition. Jennifer, I want you to understand something. The work you've been doing for us isn't just about improving our marketing effectiveness. It's about transforming how we think about our business strategy. Your frameworks have become part of our organizational DNA. Tom's words reminded me that strategic consulting at its best wasn't about managing campaigns or optimizing tactics. It was about helping organizations see their challenges and opportunities from new perspectives, developing thinking that created sustainable competitive advantages. This understanding influenced how I approached new client relationships. Instead of positioning myself as someone who could execute strategic plans, I positioned myself as someone who could develop strategic thinking capabilities within client organizations. The distinction was subtle but profound, and it attracted exactly the kind of sophisticated clients who valued intellectual rigor over presentation polish. By the end of my 6th month in independent practice, I had established something I'd never possessed at Meridian: complete professional autonomy. I chose which clients to work with based on the strategic challenges they presented, rather than office politics or hierarchical consideration. I developed frameworks and approaches without having to filter them through multiple layers of agency bureaucracy. Most importantly, I received direct recognition for my strategic thinking, without having to worry about credit attribution or political maneuvering. The contrast with Lisa's situation became even more stark when I learned through industry connections that she was struggling in her new business development role. Without access to my strategic thinking to support her presentations, she was finding it difficult to convert prospects into clients. Her charm and presentation skills were valuable, but they weren't sufficient for the kind of sophisticated strategic selling that Meridian's target clients require. Meanwhile, my consulting practice was growing through word-of-mouth referrals from clients who valued analytical depth and strategic innovation. I wasn't just replacing the income I'd lost by leaving Meridian, I was building something more sustainable and personally fulfilling. As I prepared for the board presentation at Cascade Dynamics, I realized that this was the professional future I'd been working toward without fully recognizing. Not just independence from agency politics, but the opportunity to do strategic work at the highest level, with clients who understood the difference between presentation and substance, recognition and real value. For the first time in my career, I was being compensated appropriately for the depth of my thinking, rather than my position in someone else's organizational chart. 1 year after leaving Meridian Creative, I received an invitation that perfectly encapsulated how much my professional world had changed. The Seattle Marketing Leaders Association had asked me to give the keynote presentation at their annual Strategic Thinking Summit, speaking on independent strategic consulting, building value beyond agency hierarchies. The irony of the invitation wasn't lost on me. 12 months earlier, I'd been struggling to get recognition for my strategic contributions within a single agency. Now I was being asked to share my expertise with marketing leaders across the region, speaking as an recognized authority on strategic consulting and business development. I was preparing for this presentation in my expanded office space in Pioneer Square, which had grown from a single room to a small suite that included a conference area for client meetings and a research library filled with industry analyses and strategic framework. The physical expansion reflected the growth of my consulting practice, which now included 12 ongoing client relationships and a waiting list of companies seeking strategic advisory services. The morning of the presentation, I received a call that brought the past year's journey into sharp focus. It was Sarah Chen from Evergreen Hospitality, calling with news that validated everything I'd learned about the difference between sustainable strategic thinking and short-term political maneuvering. "Jennifer, I wanted you to know that we've officially ended our relationship with Meridian," Sarah said. "After struggling with inconsistent strategic support for 8 months, we've decided to work exclusively with independent consultants who specialize in hospitality industry dynamics." Sarah went on to explain that the gap between Lisa's confident presentations and her actual understanding of their business had become impossible to ignore. Campaign recommendations that sounded impressive in meetings proved to be generic and ineffective when implemented. Strategic frameworks that had worked when I was providing the analytical foundation fell apart when Lisa tried to adapt them without understanding their underlying logic. "We kept hoping they'd find someone who could replace your expertise," Sarah continued, "but we finally realized that what we valued wasn't the agency's brand or their presentation capabilities. It was your specific analytical approach and industry knowledge." Sarah's call was followed by similar conversations throughout the week, as word spread through industry networks that I would be speaking at the marketing summit. Former colleagues, potential clients, and strategic consulting peers reached out to discuss collaboration opportunities and to share their own experiences with the evolving consulting landscape. The most significant of these conversations was with Michael Tran, who had left Meridian 3 months after my departure to start his own strategic consulting practice focused on client relationship optimization. "Jennifer, I wanted you to know that your exit catalyzed a lot of thinking about what we were really valued for versus what we were being recognized for," Michael said during one of our coffee meetings. "Watching how your consulting practice developed made me realize that the most valuable strategic thinking often happens outside traditional agency structures." Michael explained that my departure had created a ripple effect within Meridian's strategic. Other senior strategists began questioning whether their contributions were being appropriately recognized, and whether the agency structure was the best platform for sophisticated strategic work. Emily Fields had been promoted to senior strategist, but was actively exploring opportunities with consulting firms that valued analytical depth over political navigation. "What's happening to Lisa?" I asked, though I was genuinely curious rather than vindictive. "She's found her niche," Michael said with a diplomatic smile. "Business development really does suit her skills better than strategic delivery. She's good at building relationships and generating new business opportunity." The problem was trying to position her as a strategic thought leader when her strengths were in relationship management. The evening of the marketing summit, I stood before an audience of 200 marketing professionals, looking out at faces that included former colleagues, current clients, and potential strategic partners. But what struck me most was the confidence I felt in my own expertise and the clarity I had about my professional value. My presentation focused on the strategic thinking capabilities that independent consultants could offer beyond traditional agency services: deeper industry specialization, more flexible analytical approaches, and direct accountability for strategic outcomes. I shared case studies from my own practice, demonstrating how sophisticated strategic frameworks could drive measurable business results when properly implemented and supported. During the question and answer session, someone from the audience asked about the challenges of transitioning from agency work to independent consulting. "The biggest challenge," I said, "isn't building client relationships or developing business processes. It's unlearning the political dynamics that agencies often require and focusing instead on the strategic thinking that clients actually value." I went on to explain that agency environments, while valuable for certain types of marketing support, could sometimes constrain the most innovative strategic thinking through hierarchical approval processes, political considerations, and the need to maintain internal harmony over intellectual rigor. Independent consulting allows you to focus entirely on client value rather than internal politics, I concluded, but it requires absolute confidence in your own expertise and the willingness to be directly accountable for strategic outcomes. After the presentation, I was approached by several marketing directors who were considering similar transitions, as well as by companies seeking strategic consulting support. But the most meaningful conversation was with Tom Wen, who had attended specifically to hear my presentation. "Jennifer, I wanted you to hear this directly from me," Tom said. "The strategic frameworks you developed for Pacific Northwest Tech have become the foundation for our entire market approach. We've shared your thinking with our parent company, and they're implementing similar frameworks across all their subsidiaries." Tom's words represented something I'd never experienced at Meridian: the knowledge that my strategic thinking was creating value that extended far beyond individual campaigns or client relationships. My work was becoming part of larger organizational strategies, influencing decision-making processes and market approaches across multiple companies. As I drove home from the summit, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from feeling professionally invisible at Meridian to being recognized as a strategic thought leader within the regional marketing community. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been without challenges, but it represented something more significant than career advancement. I had learned that professional value isn't determined by organizational hierarchies or political maneuvering. It's determined by the quality of thinking you bring to business challenges and your ability to translate that thinking into measurable results. Lisa's short-term success at claiming credit for my work had ultimately revealed the difference between presentation skills and strategic substance. More importantly, I had discovered that the most satisfying professional recognition comes not from internal promotions or agency awards, but from clients who seek out your expertise specifically because of the value you create for their businesses. The final validation came in the form of an email waiting for me when I arrived home. It was from a Fortune 500 company in Portland inquiring about strategic consulting support for a major market expansion initiative. They had heard about my work through industry connections and were specifically interested in the analytical frameworks I'd discussed during my keynote presentation. As I read through their project description, I realized that this was the kind of strategic challenge I'd always wanted to work on: complex, high stakes, requiring sophisticated analytical thinking and innovative strategic development. It was exactly the type of work that agency politics and hierarchical constraints had prevented me from pursuing at Meridian. I responded to the inquiry with genuine excitement about the strategic possibilities, knowing that whatever developed from this conversation would be built on recognition of my actual capabilities, rather than my position within someone else's organizational structure. Lisa could keep the agency world and its political dynamics. I had found something better: the freedom to do strategic work at the highest level, with clients who valued substance over presentation and results over recognition. Most importantly, I had learned that quiet resilience and strategic patience, combined with genuine expertise and professional integrity, ultimately create opportunities that no amount of credit claiming or political maneuvering can replicate. My career was finally entirely my own. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.